For a long time, I felt tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. It was this kind of tired that you don't get after a busy week, but a kind of deeper exhaustion, feeling tense, even if actually nothing is happening. And from the outside, my life looked full and functional, but from the inside, I constantly suffered from a lack of rest. And I felt that the exhaustion was so deep, I can't just leave it as it is. I knew that if my body started screaming no, it might be a bit late. And this is when I started thinking about regaining balance, not as a concept or an achievement, but as a felt sense. I wanted to know what it would be like to move through my days without rushing internally, to breathe without my chest feeling tight, to feel settled in my own body. I wasn't looking for perfection, but for a sense of enoughness that didn't disappear the moment I stopped trying. Peace slowly stopped being an abstract idea and became something practical, something my nervous system was quietly asking for. I began to notice how often my body was signaling overwhelm long before my mind caught up. Over time, I realized that my body suffered from many symptoms of PTSD. And I learned that such a nervous system doesn't actually heal by pressure or by fixing, but by introducing safety, predictability, and gentleness, and especially fewer demands. And this is when I started quitting some things from my everyday life in order to heal my nervous system. And that's why I want to share this with you today. The things that I quit from my life as a conscious choice for a more mindful way of living. I thought that maybe you could be interested in some of the ways I introduced to simplify my life, to introduce them on your healing journey. So the first thing I quit from my life were toxic relationships. And here I don't only mean the relationships which involved drama or any conflict. In fact, I didn't have such connections with anyone. But here I also mean those which simply drained me, where I had to over-explain myself, where I had to shrink, where I felt tense without knowing why, where I adjusted too much or carried emotional weight that wasn't mine. These relationships often looked fine on the surface, but inside I felt constantly on edge. With time, I learned to listen to my body and see how it responded to such relationships. And wherever I felt unsettled, drained, or small, I decided to set my boundaries here. And it wasn't about being very harsh or cold or totally dismissing those relationships, but simply a slow movement towards giving myself more and more peace. The next thing I quit was expecting happiness from others. For a long time, without even realizing it, I was looking outside for reassurance, for safety, for a sense of being okay. And that kept me emotionally dependent in a way that actually didn't feel good, even if these relationships were loving. But that meant my peace was always dependent on someone else's mood, choices, or availability. Slowly, I learned to build an inner sense of stability, to ask myself what brings me back to myself, instead of waiting for external validation. Peace became something I practice and cultivate, not something I wait to receive. And with that, my relationships became lighter and more honest. Another big shift for me was stepping away from digital clutter and digital distractions. The constant notifications, scrolling without intention, and consuming information simply because it was there. And all of it kept my nervous system in a low-grade state of alert. And only when I reduced all of it to a minimum did I experience quiet. And then when I experienced quiet, I realized how overstimulated I had been before. And how did I start? First of all, I started clearing up space on all of my devices. So I began with my PC, then I moved to my laptop, then I moved to my inbox, and then I entered my mobile phone, which is the most important because I use it the most often. First of all, I got rid of some contacts, and then I entered all the applications. I saw which were still serving me, which I still used. Those which were of no use were deleted, and those which I still use have their notifications off. So whenever I need them, I have to enter them intentionally to see whether someone has sent me a message or not. And then I realized that the moment I did it, I started feeling peace, and I felt less and less digital noise. I didn't eliminate technology, but I became far more conscious about how and when I use it. I simplified my digital space the same way I simplified my home, choosing quiet over constant stimulation and noticing how much lighter my mind felt when it wasn't being pulled in so many directions at once. Silence became something I actively protected. The next thing I quit was multitasking and carrying more than I need. I quit multitasking both mentally and physically. Doing many things at once had become a habit, but it kept my attention scattered and my body restless. Even moments that could have been calm were filled with internal rushing. I began slowing down, doing one thing at a time, moving through my day with less urgency. Even small physical changes like carrying fewer things with me made a difference. The next thing I quit was Book FOMO. Not necessarily the books that were new, important, or recommended, but the books I simply planned to read. And with time I realized that my passion, which is reading in fact, became something that started to mentally drain me, because I was only collecting words, I was collecting data, but not absorbing them. And with time I realized that I had to do something about it, because otherwise my passion would turn into an obligation. I slowed that down, I stopped chasing lists and allowed myself to read intuitively. Reading became grounding again, something to rest into rather than keep up with. It reminded me that depth matters more than quantity. I also had to let go of worrying too much about my children's choices. I had to let go of excessive worrying about their paths. Not because I stopped caring, but because worry is not protection. I have 3 sons, and there are many things happening every day, many decisions to make. With time, I noticed how easily my fear disguised itself as responsibility. I realized I can't protect my children from everything because life is quite unexpected, and that they will best learn from their own experience rather than from my protective talk. I learned that my calm presence supports them more than my worries ever could. My trust slowly replaced control, and that shift softened not only my nervous system, but the atmosphere in our home. There was simply more room for connection. The next thing I quit was starting my day without a plan. I stopped starting my days without intention. And these weren't rigid schedules, but my gentle anchors, my simple rituals that give shape to the morning. Without them, my days often felt scattered before they even began. For a sensitive nervous system, how a day begins really matters. A small sense of direction helps the body feel oriented and safe, rather than thrown into the day unprepared. These small beginnings became quiet acts of self-care. The next thing I quit was unrealistic expectations of a perfectly tidy home. With 3 children, a dog, and my own business, real life happens here. Expecting perfection only added unnecessary pressure. Instead of perfection, I aim for functionality. Enough order to feel calm, enough flexibility to live. Peace doesn't require aesthetic control, and my home doesn't need to look untouched to feel supportive. First of all, it needs to be lived in and kind. One of the most important things I quit was living at a pace that didn't belong to me. I slowed conversations, expectations, transitions from one thing to another. I stopped rushing myself through moments that didn't need to be rushed. Healing happens with safety, not with urgency. When I allowed my life to move at a rhythm my nervous system could actually handle, everything began to soften. Even time itself started to feel different. The next thing I quit was fixing my life instead of living it. For a long time, I approached life as something that constantly needed fixing, including myself. It gave me a lot of unnecessary pressure. It was exhausting and quietly reinforcing the idea that something was wrong with me. Now I allow feelings to arise, I process them, and I let them dilute naturally over time. Healing doesn't require force or constant self-improvement. It requires presence and compassion, especially toward myself. My next mindful choice was to quit planning too far ahead. I released long, rigid timelines. Healing unfolds, life shifts, and I wanted space to respond rather than constantly predict. Letting go of strict timelines eased a lot of internal pressure. I still plan, but I allow room for change, and that flexibility lowered my anxiety more than any strategy ever did, and it gave me a permission to evolve. Finally, I quit sitting in rejection. I stopped replaying it, analyzing it, and first of all, internalizing it. I noticed how much energy I lost by staying stuck in moments that had already passed. Now I treat rejection as redirection. If something doesn't open, I trust that it wasn't meant to, and that this isn't failure, but information that guides me somewhere else. This perspective brought me a big sense of freedom. Simplifying my life didn't make it smaller. It made it quieter, it made it clearer and more honest. Each thing I quit created space. Space for balance, for peace, and for healing. It helped my nervous system exhale. This slower life is built through conscious choices, one at a time, and it continues to evolve as I do. It is not perfect, but it is true. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear what you've quit or are ready to quit to protect your peace. Thank you so much for being here, and see you soon.